Merhabalar, ben Bitlo'dan Onur. Bugün blockchain dünyasının önde gelenleriyle yapacağımız röportaj serisinin ilk bölümünde Solana Vakfı'ndan Austin Federa konuğumuz. Hello Austin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let's start with the basics. What is Solana's primary mission and how do you describe the Solana blockchain in a few sentences?
Yeah, so Solana is a layer one blockchain, which means it's not based on Ethereum or anything like that. It's its own runtime environment and its own blockchain. And the goal of Solana is to be a one single state blockchain that's able to carry all of the world's information and transact through it. So one of the interesting things here, just to differentiate it from some of the other blockchains that also talk about having high throughput, is Solana runs in one global state. And what that means is it doesn't rely on sharding or any of those other sort of parallel technologies to achieve its throughput. It has the same characteristics as like the Ethereum 1 blockchain had, where every transaction can be atomic between one another because it runs in one global state. So that's one of its main differentiators and part of why it's able to be such a high performance system.
Okay, you actually gave the answer of my next question as well. But can we dive deeper into the Solana blockchain structure? Can you give us more details about Solana's the technology behind Solana blockchain and its blockchain structure?
Yeah, certainly. So Solana is a proof of stake blockchain. Sometimes people see it as a proof of history, but proof of history is not actually a Sybil resistance mechanism or consensus mechanism. It's sort of you can think of it as like a turbocharger on top of proof of stake.
It's like a tool.
Yeah, exactly. So proof of history is one of the main innovations that allows Solana to move as quickly as it does. And proof of history works by using a distributed delay function. So basically a piece of math that takes a known time to run. And what that means is every transaction that's coming into the network when it's received by a validator can be timestamped. And it's not really like a human readable timestamp, but it basically says like this transaction came in before this transaction and after all these other transactions. So by letting the validators order all of the transactions at the point of ingest, they don't need to wait between blocks to sort of do the process that most blockchains do, which is like, hey, I'm a validator. I built this block. Does everyone else agree that this is the way this block should be built? That process it can be optimistically confirmed because all the transactions are timestamped. So what this means is that you get that initial finality quite quickly, even just after one block has ended, with a high degree of certainty. A user or an application can trust that transaction has been finalized. Full finality comes after 32 blocks, which is about 16 seconds or so. But there's never been an optimistic transaction reversed at this point. So that really allows the network to move much more quickly than other networks do and reach finality much more quickly than other networks do.
Okay, it was a good answer. What is the most distinctive feature or part of this structure when you compare it with other blockchain structure, especially those who has smart contract support?
Yeah, certainly. So, Solana is a smart contract blockchain. And so what that means is its primary role is to provide credibly neutral infrastructure for other people to run stuff on top of. And so there's some base level characteristics that any blockchain that wants to do this needs to be. It needs to be globally distributed. It needs to be decentralized. It has to be permissionless. And, Solana hits all these buckets the same way that Ethereum does, or, any other blockchain that's trying to be a credibly neutral platform hits. But I would say one of the differences here is Solana runs on a new runtime environment. This is called sea level. But basically what this is this is built on a system of Rust. And Rust is a really high performant language that you don't need to know Rust to program on Solana, but that's kind of what everything compiles down to at the end of the day right now. And that means we're not sort of inheriting a lot of the legacy of the EVM code base. And so EVM, even if you're running it locally on your computer, it maxes out at about 400 transactions per second or so, right? And so with Solana, in local benchmarking, you get very high numbers. And look, local benchmarking is not really worth anything. It's it's sort of like when Apple puts up a graph that says their new CPU is 4 times faster than the last year's one. It's like, what does that really mean in reality, right? But the steady state of the Solana network is that it's handling thousands of transactions per second right now. And there's an internal benchmarking that takes place every epoch that, benchmarks at around 60,000 transactions for pretty simple transactions as its capacity at the moment. But what's important to know here is that the limiting factor on the throughput and speed of Solana is actually the power of the hardware that it's running on. And this is where a lot of the long-term scalability of the network comes from, is it's not relying on software innovations to make the network faster every year. Google and Intel and AMD and NVIDIA and all of these companies are putting billions of dollars every year into research and development efforts to make faster processors, to make faster memory, to make faster graphics cards, to make the bandwidth between cities faster and faster. And so Solana gets to piggyback off of all of that investment that's being made by all these other companies. And simply by, upgrading the CPU inside of a validator, you can see the network increase its performance. And that doesn't rely on software innovations. That's not developers figuring out more efficient, sneaky ways to do things. All of that sort of software optimization work is definitely still ongoing. But, the same way that hash power on Bitcoin increases as people deploy more hardware, and so the hash power required to mine a block automatically scales to meet that, you're going to see the Solana transactions increasing both in complexity and capacity, just as innovations in hardware make hardware faster, which is really cool. There's no other blockchain that's really using hardware-based scaling in that way.
And is that why Solana is very important for both DeFi ecosystem and NFT ecosystem?
Yeah, so when you have a company that's looking, whether it's a founder looking to build a project, or whether it's like a large trading firm looking to build something on blockchain, or whether it's a company like Instagram thinking about how they're going to do NFTs for billions of users, they need to have some security that the software they're building on is going to scale into the future and be able to meet their demands. Look, today there's no blockchain in existence that could replace Instagram's Web 2 systems. There's no blockchain that has anywhere near the throughput to handle, 2.5 billion users uploading photos and sending messages every day and liking photos and all that stuff. But you can look at the pace of innovation on Solana, and you can look at its scalability into the future, and you can say, we can draw a line to where this is going to be sufficient to support a Web3 version of something like Instagram. If you're relying on software innovation to deliver that kind of performance, software innovation is very hard to predict. Like the folks who have been doing and building Ethereum 2 since, 2018, they've been doing a fantastic job pushing the industry forwards from a software standpoint. But, we're talking today after the testnet merge was successfully completed, but that project is years behind schedule. And, relying on software innovation doesn't deliver predictable scaling the same way that relying on hardware innovation does.
Okay. Yes, there is Web3, and Solana will take an important role in Web3 ecosystem as well. But it's a very newly emerging ecosystem indeed. It's even newer than NFTs and DeFi as well. I mean the Web3. In terms of Web3 and the rise of Web3, what kind of innovations we will see in Solana blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, the transition from a Web 2 world to a Web 3 world will take years to really fully happen. The same way that the transition from Web 1 to Web 2 took a really long time to happen. It's kind of funny because we did this exercise where we were like, what is Solana good at, right? What are the areas where Solana has characteristics that are helpful for that transition? And what we kind of come down to at the end of the day is that Solana is not particularly built for any one thing. It's not like it's a blockchain focused on DeFi. It's not like it's a blockchain focused on NFTs or focused on social networks or focused on
flexible.
Yeah, it's a very flexible architecture that is built to be incredibly high performant. And when you build stuff that's really fast and you build stuff that's flexible, it means that it can adapt to whatever comes next, right? If we roll back to this time last year, there were maybe several hundred to 1,000 NFTs on Solana. And, you know, if you talk to Anatoly or Raj back then, they were like, yeah, NFTs are going to be an interesting part of the Solana ecosystem, but they're probably not that important. Like, there's this company called Metaplex. They built this thing, but like, you know, the real growth is going to come from DeFi. Turns out we were all wrong, right? It turns out there's over 18 million NFTs that have been minted on Solana. Over $3.5 billion of economic value has been created in primary and secondary market transactions. You know, and so if we had set out and said, like, well, we have to build, like the folks at the foundation said, we have to build tooling for NFTs. That would have been something that maybe the resourcing wouldn't have put into. But instead, if you just make a really fast base layer and you make it a great place for smart developers to come and build whatever they want to build, you got to trust them that they're going to figure it out. And so what's coming next for Solana? In some ways, like, who knows, right? I don't think DeFi summer was predictable. I don't think the NFT boom was predictable that we saw. So, you know, we'll see. Now, what I can say is that the work that the foundation is doing now is all about increasing the resiliency and stability of that base layer network. So there's 3 technologies rolling out. One is Quick, which is a new networking standard. The other is local fee markets. And local fee markets are really interesting because on Ethereum, you have global fee markets, but local fee markets are going to be able to have smart contract by smart contract fees that are going to respond to demand. And the other one is stake-weighted QoS, which is a cool feature rolling out that's going to basically make sure that validators that have staked, you know, sold to them are always able to land transactions in blocks. So those 3 technologies are really sort of that next wave of innovation on the base layer for Solana.
Okay. Until now, we have seen, we have heard a lot of excellent features of Solana from you, but you know, there have been several cases when where the Solana blockchain has been disrupted in recent months. What did cause these problems, and what solutions will you bring to prevent these problems?
Yeah, so there have been 4 outages since the network went live in mainnet in March of 2020. There have been different causes for each of them. You know, most recently there was a bug that was discovered in a piece of transaction called a durable nonce transaction. And you know, one of the interesting pieces here is the failure state for Solana, and this is very much a design decision, is when the network gets into a place where it can't reach certainty, it stops. And no one stops the network. It just fails to reach consensus and stops. This is a design principle in part. You look at some networks like Polygon that instead they have block reorgs that sometimes go back and rewrite history for 6.5 minutes of transactions. And that's, I think, you know, you look at from a design principles, it's more responsible when the network can't provide certainty to simply halt as opposed to continue going and hope for the best. At the same time, Solana is moving really quickly and the user growth is incredibly fast. So there have been 2 times where the network fell over because it couldn't handle the volume of duplicate transactions that were coming into the network. In these situations, this is what both Quick and fee markets are designed to address. But every time you see user growth 10x or 20x on a network, you're going to have to rebuild some of the systems. And in both of those situations, this was a case where software systems that were thought to be robust enough to handle a certain amount of traffic got significantly more traffic than they were expected to handle and could not stand up to that load. The good news there is that every time you rebuild a system, you rebuild it for 10x, whatever the previous problem was. But this is, you know, a reality of a network that's still pretty young, right? The network went live in March of 2020. So, you know, and there's still a beta tag attached to it in large part because the core feature set like Quick, like local fee markets, like stake-weighted QoS hasn't really been completed yet. So, you know, I think what we'd ask for developers is sort of look at the base level network characteristics and make your decision on if it's a place to build for you based off of that. And that the technical challenges around scaling are, you know, in process of being solved.
Thank you. So before we come to our conversation's endpoint. I want to talk about some parts of Solana ecosystem. And first one of them is Solana Foundation. What is the role of Solana Foundation in Solana ecosystem?
Yeah, so Solana Foundation, it's very similar to what the Ethereum Foundation is in the Ethereum world. It is a Swiss foundation that administers the community treasury and, is really focused on the furthering and the adoption of the Solana protocol on a global level. And so this is the entity that gives out grants for developers for building public resource goods, and will also fund work that really isn't economically profitable yet for anyone else to do. So for example, the reference implementation work that became Metaplex, that was actually funded by a grant from the Solana Foundation, where it would have been a really big ask for someone to say, like, I'm going to build a whole new standard for NFTs on Solana from the ground up that doesn't inherit, it's got creator royalties built in, doesn't have a lot of the other stuff or it has a lot of the stuff that Ethereum's missing. That would have been a pretty big ask for someone to do, without any sort of economic support for it. And so that's a lot of what the role of the foundation is. It's to make those early investments in research and development that will unlock new areas of growth for them.
So it's like an angel investor with a great library.
Sort of. So the thing about it is the foundation doesn't have a profit-seeking motive. So most of the time, the foundation isn't actually making an investment as much as it is giving a grant. And then so for Solana Labs is an independent entity, and Solana Labs is a for-profit organization, right? That's similar to Consensus in the Ethereum world. Its job is to launch new products, to invest in things, and to sort of build out additional tooling for the ecosystem. Like, I think people forget now that like Infura and MetaMask and a few other wallets were all funded by Consensus back in the early days, and they're for-profit companies. And so Solana Foundation's playing the same role that Consensus did in the Ethereum ecosystem.
Okay, I got it. Recently, Bitlo released various kind of basket tokens. And with Bitlo basket tokens, investors can invest in a cryptocurrency basket much easier and cheaper. These tokens also include Solcoin, and Solcoin is an important part of Solana ecosystem.
Yes.
What is the importance of Solcoin in Solana ecosystem, and what kind of new use cases, further use cases Solcoin can gain in the future?
Yeah, so the function of Sol is similar to the function of Ether or the function of AVAX or any other token on another blockchain. It's used to pay the transaction fees on the network. So the base layer transaction fee is 5,000 lamports, which is a subdivision of Sol. I think it's 0.000005 Sol. It works out to about $0.0002 right now in terms of a transaction fee. But obviously that cost of transaction is based on what the USD equivalent of Sol is in terms of that regard. So Sol is used to pay that base layer transaction fee on the network. It's also used to pay any prioritization fees as fee markets roll out across the network. And then it's also used in proof of stake as the asset that is staked to help secure the network. So in proof of stake networks, the way you secure the network is based on assets at risk. And so validators are incentivized not to misbehave because they basically have put stake at risk that says, if I misbehave, these are my tokens, and the network can punish me if my validator misbehaves. And so Sol acts as a security guarantee on the network as well.
Thank you. We are almost at the end, but I also want to ask you, if you were a developer or an end user, why would you prefer Solana blockchain compared to other blockchains? Just in a few sentences.
Yeah, so look, I think that we're still in incredibly early days of blockchain ecosystem. There's at most 10 or 20 million users of blockchain daily right now. And so there's very much space for lots of different solutions to coexist and grow. What I would say though is that Solana has, a really strong potential to, because of its hardware scaling components, to deliver a future that is scalable to meet the needs that developers face. And you really, when you're building on systems, you want to make sure that that system is going to not limit your growth into the future. I think Solana offers a really strong platform for developers to build on.
Okay, and finally, what awaits Solana in the future? I mean, can you tell us about Solana's roadmap?
So there isn't really much of a roadmap, and that's sort of by architecture and design, right? Anatoly, who's the co-founder of Solana and still one of the chief architects of the network, has this philosophy that, a roadmap is just a series of promises you're going to break to your users. And you see this across the whole industry where nothing ever ships on time. Most roadmaps get changed. Major features that a blockchain says they're going to integrate, they don't actually integrate. So the best place to stay up to date on what's coming for the network is solana.com/upgrades. That's a blog post that's regularly updated with, it's still fairly technical, but not GitHub level technical information on what's coming and what changes are coming to the network. But I think when we started at the foundation working on some of these upgrades, the assumption was that Quick was going to ship before fee markets. Turns out fee markets shipped before Quick. So if you put stuff in a linear roadmap, it really limits what developers are able to do. And, sometimes components are ready earlier than others. And so I think it makes a lot more sense to do things that way.
Sounds like a perspective of an artist. You should be creative. Yeah.
Very much.
Okay,
so.
thank you so much. Is there anything you want to add?
I think this covers it. Thanks for having me.
I thank you. We thank you. And goodbye.